The Vega cousins Isabella, Marco, and Elena grew up in the same neighborhood, in a modest town where family meant everything. Their parents were siblings, living only a few streets apart, and because both families worked long hours to make ends meet, the children often spent their afternoons and weekends together. For them, the concept of cousins was too small. They were more like siblings, bound not only by blood, but by the countless moments that stitched their lives together. From the very beginning, the trio built their little world. Summers were filled with barefoot races down dusty roads, mango-eating contests in their grandmother's backyard, and late-night storytelling sessions under mosquito nets. Marco, being the only boy, often acted as the protective older brother, though Isabella and Elena were quick to remind him that he didn't always have the final say. Isabella had a spark of leadership, a natural tendency to take charge of games and school projects, while Elena, the youngest, carried a gentler, more empathetic nature. Their bond was tested early on. The Vegas were not a wealthy family. Their parents were hardworking but constantly juggling bills, debts, and dreams of a better future for their children. Some days there wasn't enough food on the table, so the cousins learned to share everything from snacks to school supplies. A single pack of colored pencils might last through all three children's art assignments, passed around carefully so no one felt left out. Instead of complaining about what they didn't have, they learned to be resourceful and creative, making fun out of very little. School was another shared battlefield. Marco was the first to face bullies at school, targeted for his worn-out shoes and the way he packed home, made lunches wrapped in newspaper instead of plastic. Isabella and Elena never let him fight those battles alone. Isabella, with her fiery temper, once stood up to a group of kids teasing Marco, declaring, "We don't need new shoes to be somebody, we already are." Elena, though less confrontational, would comfort Marco afterward, reminding him that their grandmother always said, "Your worth is not in what you wear, but in what you carry inside." This sense of solidarity became the defining feature of their childhood. They weren't just cousins, they were each other's shield, cheerleader, and confidant. If Isabella fell sick, Marco and Elena would sneak over after school to bring her class notes. When Elena failed her first math test, Marco stayed up late tutoring her, despite struggling himself. And when Marco secretly dreamed of being an engineer, Isabella encouraged him to keep sketching machines in his notebooks, promising that one day they would see his ideas come to life. Sundays were sacred to the Vega cousins. That was when the whole extended family gathered at their grandmother's house. The small kitchen would be filled with the aroma of arroz con pollo and the sound of laughter spilling into the street. The cousins had their own corner in the backyard, where they built forts out of old sheets and planned their futures. Sometimes they imagined becoming famous, a singer, an inventor, a teacher. Other times their dreams were simpler, just having a life where their parents wouldn't have to work so hard. Yet, despite their closeness, the cousins also quarreled like siblings. Arguments over board games or who got the last piece of cake were frequent. Isabella's stubbornness clashed with Marco's protective nature, while Elena often cried when peace couldn't be restored. But what made them different was how they always came back together. Their grandmother often reminded them, "Family is like a tree. You can bend its branches, but its roots must stay strong." No matter how heated the fight, by the end of the day, they were back under the same tree in the yard, laughing at something silly. The community around them also admired their unity. Neighbors would often say, "The Vega kids are inseparable. You can't call one without the others showing up." They were known for walking to school side by side, for volunteering at local events together, and for protecting each other against anyone who tried to take advantage of them. Their togetherness became a quiet source of strength, not just for them but for their parents, who saw in their children a promise of a better tomorrow. As they grew older, the bond deepened. Teenage years usually push kids apart, but for the Vegas, it pulled them closer. When Marco struggled with the pressure of being the man of the family, after his father lost his job, Isabella reminded him that strength didn't always mean carrying everything alone. Elena, with her soft voice and listening ear, made sure neither of them drowned in unspoken worries. They learned to talk through their fears about money, about school, about the future. By the time they reached adulthood, the Vega cousins had built a foundation of love, loyalty, and resilience. They had survived childhood hardships not by escaping them, but by facing them together. Their bond was more than just shared bloodlines, it was a pact, a silent promise that no matter what life threw at them, be it poverty, heartbreak, or failure, they would never face it alone. This unshakable childhood bond would later be tested in ways they never expected, especially when emotions became complicated and love blurred the lines of family loyalty. But everything they had endured growing up, every sacrifice, every hardship, every lesson from their grandmother had already prepared them for those trials. The love triangle that would come years later could have shattered them, but because of the childhood bond they had built, it instead became the fire that forged them even stronger. The bond between Isabella, Marco, and Elena was unshakable through their childhood and teenage years. But as they grew older, life added layers of complexity that none of them had prepared for. College, jobs, and personal dreams took them down different paths, but they always circled back to each other. They had promised never to let distance break them. Yet, what no one expected was that love, the very thing that often binds families and friends together, would quietly creep in and test their loyalty in a way poverty, hardships, and outside pressures never had. It began subtly, almost invisibly. Marco, the natural protector since childhood, had grown into a tall, confident young man with a quiet strength. His struggles had molded him into someone resilient, and people noticed. Isabella, always the fiery leader of the trio, was drawn to his steadiness. She admired how Marco handled responsibility without complaint, how he worked 2 jobs to support his parents after his father's health declined, and how he still found time to check on her and Elena. At first, Isabella brushed it off as admiration. After all, Marco was her cousin family, but admiration has a way of sneaking into the heart. She found herself lingering in conversations with him, laughing a little too loudly at his jokes and worrying about him in ways that went beyond cousinly care. She never admitted it, not even to herself, because she knew how dangerous those feelings could be. Elena, on the other hand, felt something similar but in a different way. Being the youngest, she had always leaned on Marco, confiding in him about her insecurities, her fears, and her quiet dreams. Marco was patient with her, listening when she rambled and encouraging her when she doubted herself. Over time, that safe space became something more. Elena found herself looking forward to every moment with him, the walks, the small chats, the way he defended her when others dismissed her gentleness as weakness. Neither Isabella nor Elena realized that they were treading the same path. Both were falling quietly, cautiously, and unwillingly for the same person. Marco, for his part, wasn't blind. He noticed the subtle differences. Isabella's playful teasing carried a spark that hadn't been there before. Elena's eyes lingered a little longer when he spoke. He didn't want to acknowledge it, because acknowledging it meant choosing, and choosing meant breaking something precious. So he stayed silent, hoping the feelings would fade on their own. But silence can sometimes make things louder. The first cracks appeared during a family gathering. The cousins had always been inseparable at such events, but this time the tension was almost tangible. Isabella snapped at Elena over something trivial, who should help in the kitchen, and Elena, uncharacteristically, snapped back. The family brushed it off as normal cousin bickering, but Marco knew something was wrong. Later that night, he found Isabella crying in the backyard. She confessed, not directly, but enough. "I don't know why my heart feels confused," she whispered. Marco froze, torn between wanting to comfort her and the fear of what comfort might mean. Not long after, Elena confided in Isabella, unaware of what Isabella herself was feeling. "Sometimes, I think Marco understands me better than anyone," she admitted shyly, her voice filled with vulnerability. Isabella's stomach sank, but she forced a smile, pretending to be supportive. That night, Isabella lay awake, torn between her love for her cousin and her loyalty to her family. The love triangle wasn't built on betrayal or dishonesty. It was born out of proximity, shared struggles, and the natural bonds of trust that made it even more painful. None of them had wanted this. None of them had asked for it, but hearts rarely follow rules. As weeks turned into months, the unspoken emotions grew heavier. Their once effortless closeness became strained. Mako started avoiding being alone with either cousin, fearing his presence might unintentionally encourage them. Isabella buried herself in work, trying to drown her feelings in ambition. Elena grew quieter, sensing the tension but not knowing how to resolve it. The trio who had once been inseparable now walked on eggshells around one another. Even their grandmother, wise and observant, noticed the shift. "You three used to laugh like the world belonged to you," she told them one evening. "Now you carry silence heavier than stones." The breaking point came when Mako received an opportunity to work abroad. He was torn. It was his dream, but leaving meant abandoning Isabella and Elena in the middle of their unspoken storm. When he told them, Isabella encouraged him to go, though her voice trembled. Elena quietly excused herself, tears brimming in her eyes. That moment, Mako realized the truth he had been running from. Both of them cared for him in ways deeper than family bonds. The situation could have easily shattered them forever. Jealousy could have turned into resentment. Love could have mutated into rivalry. Many families break apart over far less. But the Vega cousins had something stronger: their childhood bond, their grandmother's wisdom, and the unshakable truth that no relationship, no matter how complicated, was worth destroying the foundation they had built together. The love triangle was not just about romance, it was about choices. Choices between ego and family, desire and loyalty, passion and peace. And though the confusion and hurt were real, what would eventually matter most was how they responded. In the end, the love triangle wasn't the end of their story, it was the challenge that would eventually bring them closer, teaching them that love can take many forms, but family, if protected, can outlast them all. Every story of love and family has a moment when things fall apart, when silence speaks louder than words and bonds feel like they might snap under the weight of unspoken emotions. For the Vega cousins, Isabella, Mako, and Elena, that moment came after months of tension, hesitation, and unaddressed feelings. At first, the changes were subtle. Family dinners that used to be filled with laughter became stiff. Mako, who once sat comfortably between Isabella and Elena, now chose a seat at the end of the table. Isabella distracted herself with her career, throwing her energy into long hours at the office. But her absence at family gatherings left a void. Elena, normally cheerful, grew quieter, often excusing herself early to avoid conversations that felt too heavy. The once inseparable trio was unraveling. Their parents noticed, their grandmother noticed, even the younger cousins noticed. But no one dared ask questions. The Vega cousins had always been the example of unity. To see cracks forming between them was unsettling. The breaking point came one evening when Isabella hosted a small gathering at her apartment. She had planned it as a way to bring the cousins together again, to recapture some of the warmth they had lost. She cooked their favorite childhood meals: arroz con pollo, fried plantains, and flan for dessert. The apartment smelled like home, but the air felt different. Mako arrived first, carrying a small bouquet of flowers for Isabella's table. Elena came shortly after, bringing a homemade dessert. The three of them sat around the table, the food untouched for a long while. They made small talk about work, about neighbors, about the weather, but it all felt forced, like actors reciting lines from a play. Then Isabella broke the silence. "We can't keep pretending everything is fine," she said, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. "We're not the same anymore. We're avoiding each other, and I hate it." Elena lowered her gaze, her fork tracing circles on her plate. Mako shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his hair. No one spoke for a long moment, the weight of her words pressing down on them. Finally, Elena whispered, "Maybe it's because we're not fine. Maybe we've been lying to ourselves." Isabella's eyes snapped up, meeting Elena's. The air thickened. They both knew what was being said without saying it outright. Marco's heart pounded in his chest. He had dreaded this moment, but it was here. You both feel something," Isabella said finally, her voice breaking. "And so do I. But what are we supposed to do with that?" The room fell into stunned silence. For the first time, the truth hung in the air, raw and undeniable. Elena's eyes filled with tears. Marco buried his face in his hands. Isabella, usually so strong, looked vulnerable and lost. The conversation spiraled from there. Words spilled out, words that had been bottled up for months. Isabella confessed how she admired Marco, how his strength and sacrifices had drawn her heart in ways she never expected. Elena admitted how Marco made her feel safe, how she couldn't ignore the connection she felt with him. Marco confessed that he cared deeply for both of them, but the thought of hurting either was unbearable. It was messy, painful, and heartbreaking. Voices rose, tears flowed, and at one point, Isabella stormed into the kitchen just to catch her breath. Elena cried openly, admitting she felt betrayed by her own heart. Marco sat in the middle, crushed under the weight of a decision he couldn't make. By the end of the night, nothing was resolved. In fact, it felt worse. Isabella avoided eye contact as she cleared the plates. Elena left early, her eyes red and swollen. Marco lingered for a while, trying to help Isabella clean up, but she shook her head and told him to go. "I need space," she whispered. That night marked the true breaking point. The days that followed were some of the hardest in their lives. Family gatherings became a battlefield of avoidance. Isabella found excuses not to attend. Elena stayed in corners with distant relatives, and Marco often left early, unable to bear the tension. The bond that had carried them through childhood, through poverty, bullying, and hardship, now seemed fragile. Their grandmother, who had always been the anchor of the family, finally stepped in. She called the three of them to her house one Sunday afternoon. No excuses, no delays. They obeyed, though reluctantly. The old woman sat them down at the wooden dining table that had seen decades of family meals. She looked at each of them carefully, her eyes sharper than ever despite her age. "I don't know what has come between you," she said, "but I know this. Whatever it is not worth destroying what you've built together." Tears filled Elena's eyes again. Isabella swallowed hard. Marco couldn't meet his grandmother's gaze. "Love is complicated," the grandmother continued, "but family is sacred. You can love many people in your lifetime, but you only get one family. Do not let your pride, your silence, or even your hearts destroy that." Those words stayed with them. They didn't fix everything overnight, but they planted a seed. Each cousin realized that they were at a crossroads. They could let this love triangle define them, or they could choose something greater: forgiveness, unity, and the bond they had promised never to break. The breaking point was painful, but it was also necessary. Sometimes people have to reach the edge of falling apart to understand the true value of what they might lose. For the Vega cousins, it was the moment that forced them to confront their feelings honestly, to strip away the silence, and to realize that their family bond was far too important to sacrifice. And though they didn't yet know how, deep down, each of them began to choose family over ego, love over rivalry, and unity over division. After the breaking point, the Vega cousins felt as if they were walking on shattered glass. Their closeness, once effortless, now seemed impossible to reclaim. Every family gathering reminded them of the night when secrets spilled, when tears blurred the lines between love and loyalty. For weeks, they avoided each other as much as possible. Isabella poured herself into work, Elena into her studies, and Marco into long shifts that kept him too exhausted to think. But avoidance doesn't mend brokenness, it only hides it, and the silence between them weighed heavier than the fight itself. Their grandmother, who had always been the heart of the Vega family, refused to let the bond she had watched them nurture since childhood slip away. One Sunday afternoon, she invited the three cousins to her house. It wasn't unusual. Sundays were family days, but this time, she made sure it was just them. No aunts, no uncles, no little cousins, only Isabella, Marco, and Elena. When they arrived, the table was already set with steaming bowls of sopa de palo and warm bread. But their grandmother didn't serve the food immediately. Instead, she looked at each of them with eyes that had seen decades of life, of loss, of love. "Sit," she said firmly. They obeyed. For a long moment, she didn't speak. She let the silence stretch until they were uncomfortable enough to look at each other, really look at each other for the first time in weeks. Isabella's jaw tightened, Elena's eyes darted down to the table, and Marco shifted in his seat like a guilty schoolboy. Finally, their grandmother said softly, "Do you remember when you were children, how you shared everything? Food, pencils, even dreams. Back then, you had nothing, but you were rich because you had each other. Now you have more, but you are poorer because you have let pride come between you." Her words stung because they were true. Isabella felt her throat tighten. She had built a life on being strong, ambitious, and independent. But in her determination to protect herself from heartbreak, she had shut out her cousins, the very people who had lifted her up since childhood. Elena, gentle and kind, had let her hurt turn into withdrawal, believing silence would protect her heart when in reality it only deepened the wound. Marco, caught in the middle, had allowed guilt to paralyze him rather than choosing honesty from the beginning. Their grandmother continued, "Love can make you blind, ego can make you foolish, but family is forever unless you choose to throw it away. So I ask you, which is more important, winning a heart or keeping your family whole?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Elena was the first to break. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she whispered, "I don't want to lose you, Isabella. Not for anything, not even for love." Isabella's eyes filled too. For weeks she had carried anger at herself, at her feelings, at the situation, but in that moment, her anger melted into something else, relief. She reached across the table and took Elena's hand. "I don't want to lose you either. You're more than my cousin, you're my sister, and sisters don't compete, they protect each other." Marco, who had been silent, finally spoke. His voice was thick, heavy with regret. "I should have said something sooner. I thought staying quiet would protect us, but all it did was hurt you both. I care for you deeply, but not in a way that should divide us. You two mean more to me than anything else in this world. If I ever made you feel otherwise, I'm sorry." In that moment, something shifted. The walls that had been built over weeks of silence and hurt began to crumble. The cousins realized that their bond didn't have to be a casualty of misplaced feelings. Instead, it could be strengthened by honesty, humility, and forgiveness. They spent the rest of the afternoon really talking. They admitted their fears, their confusion, their guilt. They cried. They laughed at themselves for letting things spiral so far. And with every word, every tear, every smile, they began stitching their bond back together. But choosing family over ego wasn't just about one emotional conversation. It required action. In the weeks that followed, Isabella made an effort to be more present, showing up at family gatherings instead of hiding behind her work. Elena opened up more, refusing to retreat into silence when things got hard. Marco stopped running away from tough conversations, learning instead to face them with courage. They even created a new tradition. Once a month, just the three of them would meet, no extended family, no distractions. Sometimes they cooked together, sometimes they went for long walks, and sometimes they simply sat and talked about life. These moments became their way of rebuilding, of reminding themselves that no career, no relationship, and no misunderstanding could ever replace what they had. The shift didn't go unnoticed. Their family saw it, their community saw it. People who had once whispered about the tension between the Vega cousins now admired how they had handled something so delicate. Their story became an example that conflict doesn't have to end in separation, that love triangles don't always destroy families, and that choosing humility over ego is what keeps bonds alive. Isabella, Marco, and Elena often reflected on what could have been. They knew that if they had chosen pride, jealousy, or silence, they might have lost each other forever. Instead, by choosing family, they discovered a deeper kind of love, one built not on romance, but on forgiveness, loyalty, and the unbreakable roots of shared history. It wasn't easy, healing never is, but it was worth it. And as their grandmother always reminded them, the strongest families are not the ones that never fight, but the ones that choose to forgive and keep standing together. After weeks of difficult conversations, painful honesty, and countless tears, the Vega cousins began to settle into a new rhythm. They had faced the truth, acknowledged the unspoken feelings, and most importantly, chosen not to let their bond collapse under the weight of ego. But even after forgiveness, the question remained, what now? Love triangles don't simply disappear because words are spoken or apologies are made. Feelings take time to fade, and scars take time to heal. The cousins knew this. They knew that trying to erase everything that had happened would only cheapen the growth they had fought so hard for. Instead, they chose a different path to redefine what love meant to them. For Isabella, this meant reevaluating her own idea of love. She had always been strong-willed, chasing after her career and independence with fierce determination. When she realized her feelings for Marco, she was shocked not just because he was her cousin, but because it made her feel vulnerable in a way she wasn't used to. Now, having faced that vulnerability head-on, Isabella discovered that love wasn't always about possession or romance. Love could mean respect. Love could mean cheering someone on, even if they weren't meant to be yours. She told Marco one evening during one of their new monthly meetups, "I thought I wanted you to choose me, but now I realize what I really want is for us to never lose each other. That's a different kind of love, one I don't ever want to risk again." Elena, on the other hand, had always looked to Marco as her safe place. His patience, his steady presence, had been like a shelter for her soft heart. For a long time, she confused that safety with romance. But as she matured through the storm, she realized something deeper. Sometimes we fall for the people who protect us because we mistake comfort for destiny. She admitted this one evening, shy but sincere, "Maybe I didn't love you the way I thought I did. Maybe I loved what you represented, safety, but I don't want my future to depend on someone else's strength. I want to grow into my own." Marco listened quietly, his heart heavy but relieved. For months he had carried guilt, terrified of breaking the bond between the two women he loved most in his life. But hearing Isabella and Elena speak with such clarity freed him. He realized that the love he felt for them was indeed deep. But it wasn't romantic love, it was something bigger, something irreplaceable. He said softly, "You are my family, my sisters in every way that matters. If I ever confused you, I'm sorry, but know this, I'd give my life for you both. That's the kind of love I carry." It was in those moments that the cousins began to understand that love isn't one-dimensional. It isn't always about romance, passion, or marriage. Sometimes the strongest love is the kind that stays when everything else changes. The kind that builds you up, forgives your mistakes, and stands by you even when life gets messy. They began to lean into this new understanding. Instead of avoiding each other, they embraced the awkwardness, turning it into laughter. They joked about how dramatic their story had been, how it could have turned into a soap opera, but instead had become a lesson in resilience. Humor became part of their healing, a way to take the sting out of what once felt unbearable. More importantly, they started supporting each other in new ways. Isabella, who had always been career-driven, began mentoring Elena as she pursued her studies, encouraging her to be confident in her own path. Elena, in turn, reminded Isabella to slow down and not lose herself in ambition. Marco, carrying the responsibility of caring for his parents, leaned on both cousins for emotional support, something he had rarely allowed himself to do before. Their bond became a partnership not defined by rivalry, but by collaboration. In time, life naturally pulled them toward new relationships. Isabella met someone at work who admired her strength, but also respected her independence. Elena found herself falling for a classmate who appreciated her gentleness and encouraged her to stand tall. Marco, too, opened his heart to someone outside the family, a woman who respected his loyalty to Isabella and Elena and never asked him to compromise it. And through it all, the cousins remained each other's constants. They celebrated each other's new beginnings, attended birthdays, graduations, and holidays together. When Isabella got a promotion, Elena and Marco showed up with balloons and flowers. When Elena gave her first presentation at university, Isabella and Marco sat in the front row, cheering louder than anyone else. When Marco's parents' health struggles worsened, Isabella and Elena organized schedules to help him manage. What could have destroyed them became the very thing that made them stronger. The love triangle, once a threat, transformed into a lesson. Love does not always have to end in rivalry or regret. It can evolve. It can take a new shape, one that honors the past while building a healthier future. Their grandmother often reminded them of this transformation. When you were children, you learned to share food and toys. Now, as adults, you have learned to share love not by dividing it, but by multiplying it. The Vega cousins smiled when they heard those words, because they knew she was right. They had discovered a different kind of love, one that didn't demand ownership or jealousy, but offered freedom and support. A love that wasn't about romance, but about family, unity, and lifelong loyalty. And in the end, that kind of love lasted far longer than fleeting passion ever could. Years passed, and the storm that once threatened to tear the Vega cousins apart had become little more than a memory not forgotten, but transformed into a lesson they carried with pride. What could have been the end of their bond became instead the very thing that defined it. Isabella, Marco, and Elena had built lives of their own. Isabella became a successful project manager, admired not only for her skills but for her integrity. She often credited her cousins for keeping her grounded, reminding her that ambition without love was empty. Elena graduated with honors in education, dedicating her career to teaching young children with patience and kindness. Marco, who had once doubted whether he could balance duty and dreams, opened a small but thriving construction business, one that provided jobs for others in their community. But beyond their individual achievements, what truly stood out was the way they remained inseparable. They were no longer the three barefoot kids racing down dirt roads, yet their bond carried the same energy, the same closeness, the same loyalty. Their grandmother, now frail but still sharp, often watched them with pride. "I told you," she would say, "family is the one thing worth fighting for, and you fought well." The Vega cousins didn't keep their story hidden. On the contrary, they shared it first with close friends, then with younger relatives, and eventually with their broader community. They didn't tell it with shame, but with honesty, because they wanted others to know that conflict, no matter how complicated, doesn't have to end in destruction. At family gatherings, Isabella would sometimes laugh and say, "Remember when we almost ruined everything?" Elena would roll her eyes, Marco would chuckle, and together they would explain how love had once confused them, but forgiveness had saved them. It became a kind of family parable, told not to entertain but to inspire. Their younger cousins, just entering their teenage years, would listen wide-eyed. Some would ask, "Weren't you embarrassed? Weren't you afraid people would judge you?" Isabella would answer firmly, "Embarrassment doesn't matter when truth can help someone else. What matters is choosing what lasts over what fades." And what lasted was their unity. The cousins turned their bond into action. They started small, volunteering together at local events, mentoring young people in their neighborhood. Over time, their influence grew. Marco offered apprenticeships to high school students who struggled to find direction. Isabella organized career workshops for young women, encouraging them not to fear leadership. Elena tutored struggling children for free, reminding them that kindness and patience could change lives. They didn't see themselves as heroes. To them, it was simply the natural extension of what they had learned. That true love, whether between cousins, friends, or communities, is about lifting others up, not tearing them down. But the community noticed. People admired not just their success, but their togetherness. In a world where families often broke apart over disagreements, jealousy, or pride, the Vega cousins stood as proof that reconciliation was possible. Their story became an example told at church gatherings, school assemblies, and even local leadership seminars. One day, at a youth conference, Elena was invited to speak. Standing in front of a room full of teenagers, she told their story from the beginning: the childhood bond, the unexpected love triangle, the painful breaking point, and the choice to put family first. She ended with words that would stay with everyone in the room. "We thought love might divide us, but it ended up teaching us the greatest truth, that unity is the strongest kind of love there is. We chose family over ego, forgiveness over pride, and now we stand stronger than ever. You can do the same." The audience erupted in applause, not because the story was dramatic, but because it was real. It was messy, human, and relatable, and it showed that even the most complicated conflicts could lead to healing if people were willing to humble themselves. Years later, as they stood together at their grandmother's funeral, the Vega cousins felt the weight of her words more than ever. The grief was heavy, but so was the gratitude. They knew she had been the one to remind them of what truly mattered, the one who refused to let them throw away their bond for the sake of fleeting feelings. After the service, as they walked side by side, Marco whispered, "We're her legacy." Isabella nodded. "And it's our responsibility to live it out." Elena, wiping her tears, added softly, "Forever." And so they did. The legacy of the Vega cousins was not just about their personal success or even their unity. It was about the message they carried, that love comes in many forms, but family love, if nurtured, protected, and chosen over ego, can last forever. They had turned what could have been a tragedy into testimony. What could have been a fracture became their foundation, and what could have divided them forever instead bound them together in ways deeper than they could have imagined. Their story lived on not only in their family, but in the countless lives they touched. They were proof that unity isn't about perfection, it's about choice, choosing forgiveness when anger feels easier, choosing humility when pride feels louder, choosing love that protects, not love that possesses. The Vega cousins would always be remembered, not for the triangle that almost broke them, but for the circle of unity they chose instead, a circle that could not be broken, no matter what.